Okay, so with this little screencast, I'm going to try and get you guys into some examples for how one species ultimately becomes two species. And that is speciation and natural selection. So in Darwin, he had his model of adaptive radiation, and that demonstrated how organisms diversify from a common ancestor into a multitude of morphological and physiological forms as new resources and niches become available. So, as he's sailing around the world, he'd be at a mainland and then he'd find these islands and he'd be like, hey, these kind of look like what's at the mainland, but the environment's a little bit different. So maybe they came from a single common ancestor, except over time they became slightly different because they live in different environments. So ultimately, what I'm going to ask you to do is to describe the phases of speciation and the stages of natural selection that develop a division between species. So when we look at speciation as a whole, we are going to start with a population, a group of organisms living in one specific area. We'll call that the ancestral population. They are going to have to somehow become reproductively isolated, and that is separation. Over time, in these new environments, each new population, which is reproductively isolated, will go through natural selection on its own. Each population will have overpopulation, inherited variation, a struggle to survive, and survival of the fittest. And because the environments are not identical to each other, their natural selection will occur, and each individual population will be slightly different from the others. We say we have division and official speciation when if these two populations were brought back into the same environment, they would not be able to reproduce and make viable offspring with each other. So we went from one species ultimately to two species. And we follow this separation, adaptation, division, and it's within adaptation that we talk about natural selection. So one big point I want to make here before we jump in any further is that need, try, and want are not very accurate words when we come to explaining evolution. The population or an individual does not want to evolve or doesn't try to evolve. It doesn't need. Okay, so the natural selection cannot try to supply what an organism needs. Natural selection simply selects among whatever variations already exist in the population. The result is evolution. Evolution is not like they adapted because they needed to adapt or they wanted to evolve. That's not how evolution works. It just selects amongst variations that already exist through genetic mutations or gene shuffling. So, first example, and again, this kind of goes into our Jeff Corwin video that we watched. First of all, we're going to have separation. So, if we are looking at the Galapagos Islands, which is, what Darwin is famous for, we have some separation. Populations of the ancestral population become reproductively isolated. So the first example we're going to look at are the green iguanas, the rainforest iguanas of Ecuador. And somehow they drifted out, somehow they occupied these islands, and this mainland iguana made it out to the different islands of the Galapagos Islands. So we have separation. From there, we have adaptation. And each population is going to go through natural selection independently, and they're going to favor traits that are advantageous and unique to the features in each location. And in that video, you saw that each island is slightly different. So we have some islands that are young and full of black volcanic lava, and other islands have been around for a really long time. They have a greater change in elevation, they have more plant varieties, and they just have a different environment. So the first stage where adaptations come about in the series of the 4 stages of natural selection is overpopulation. So all living things are going to overshoot their carrying capacity, and the carrying capacity is the amount of organisms that the environment could sustain. So we're going to have too many babies. And then we're going to have inherited variation. So those babies are also going to be slightly different. They're not clones, right? These all look like these general initial ancestral species. But through mutations and gene shuffling, we're going to have slightly different iguanas being born. Now, again, not all babies are identical to one another. From there, we're going to have struggle to survive. The environment is going to favor some organisms, and others are going to succumb to disease. They're not going to be able to get enough food for whatever reason. They may not be able to attract mates, but there is going to be a struggle to survive and a struggle ultimately to breed. So if we look at this island first, who's going to make it here? Who's going to have an advantage and who's going to get picked off? So there's going to be a struggle to survive. Bang. Those are all gone. And now let's swap over to this island. There's going to be, again, struggle to survive, and bang, all those are eliminated. So it's those that are able to reproduce that are fit. So survival of the fittest is the ability to pass on their genes to the next generation. And if these genes prove to be successful, these genes are going to pass on to the next generation. And if these genes are successful in this environment, these genes are going to pass on to the next generation. And that is adaptation. We started with these ancestral species, but we have adaptations that come about, changes in color, the ability to shoot salt out of their nostrils. These guys are adapted well to eating cactus. So we have different varieties, but overall adaptations have taken place. The final step of speciation is division. When we say we have an official new species when no viable offspring can be reproduced between populations. So these guys can't make babies anymore, and these guys can't make babies anymore. So we have officially new species that have come about. Again, separation, adaptation, division. Separation, we have a change in location. Adaptation, we have a change in traits due to natural selection. Overpopulation is too many babies. They overshoot the carrying capacity. Inherited variation, different babies. Struggle to survive. Death eliminates genes. And survival of the fittest, the favored genes are passed on. So there's going to be competition for limited resources here. And the genes that are successful are going to be passed on. Division, they're no longer able to interbreed. Now we have a new species. One species is separated. Ultimately, we end up with 2 species or more than 2 species at the end. So, how does one species become 2 species? When I give tests where I don't give them any help instead of projects, this is how we help to remember how one species becomes 2 species. SAD, separation, adaptation, division, and these are the 4 stages of natural selection that leads to adaptations: overpopulation, inherited variation, struggle to survive, survival of the fittest. So, next example, Galapagos tortoises. These were also mentioned in the video. There are different species of Galapagos tortoises, or different races, and there's different tortoises around the world. Okay, so shell size and shape vary between populations. On islands with humid highlands, the tortoises are larger, with dome shells and short necks. On islands with dry lowlands, the tortoises are smaller, with saddleback shells and long necks. Charles Darwin's observations of these differences on the second voyage of the Beagle in 1835 contributed to the development of his theory of evolution. Again, he's like, he's sailing around the world. He's like, these tortoises in South America look different than the tortoises on the Galapagos Islands, but they kind of look the same in certain ways too, but ultimately they do look different. So we've got these saddleback varieties. They have these long necks, right? And longer limbs. They have a different shaped shell, and saddleback tortoises originate from small islands less than 500 meters in elevation with dry habitats that are more limited in food and other resources. The dome-shelled tortoises are found on larger islands with humid highlands over 800 meters in elevation with abundant vegetation near the ground. These tortoises tend to be larger with shorter necks and limbs. So, if I would give you all that information, could you describe how one species becomes two species using this chart? So, what in the heck goes in this chart? Well, separation, adaptation, division. Within adaptation, we have overpopulation, inherited variation, struggle to survive, and survival of the fittest. So now we have to just, instead of just explaining what these are, we have to apply them to an example. So with the tortoises, there's two populations of tortoises developed on the Galapagos Islands as ancestral tortoises drifted from South America. Adaptation. Those two populations developed different traits based on where they were located. The saddleback tortoises have long necks and limbs and are smaller, while dome-shelled tortoises are bigger. When we talk about overpopulation, more offspring are born than can survive. Inherited variation, we need to talk about the differences in the offspring. Through mutations and gene shuffling, the offspring are not clones of the parents, but they're different from parents and from one another. Some tortoises have smaller shells and longer limbs, others were larger and more protective. In struggles to survive, they're going to compete for limited resources such as food, water, shelter, and mates. They also have to avoid predators and not succumb to disease. Saddleback tortoises could reach more vegetation where it's limited. Survival of the fittest. On islands where food is limited, the saddleback tortoises were able to get more food and live longer and reproduce more. Offspring thus carried on the saddleback traits that come from the genes. We have a division in species when they can no longer interbreed and produce viable offspring. And again, that's how you walk through an example describing each stage of speciation and all of the phases of natural selection. Next example, finches. This is another big thing that Darwin is well known for, but these finches are not Galapagos finches. These honeycreepers and parrot-bill honeycreepers, these are finches. Even though they don't look very much alike, these are actually similar related species in Hawaii. So we're going to break this down. What comes first? Separation. Then adaptation. What do we break adaptation down into? Overpopulation, inherited variation, struggle to survive, survival of the fittest. Finally, we get a division when they are no longer able to interbreed. Again, when we break down this chart, separation, we need to talk about different locations. Adaptation, we have to talk about different traits. More born, again, when we use simple language, too many babies, different babies, babies compete, best babies survive and pass on their genes. Division, we have different species, different locations, different traits, different species. So let's break it down. For many years, scientists believed that many of the birds on the Hawaiian Islands were very distantly related to each other and to the birds of the mainland, 2,000 miles away. New molecular and genomic analysis proved that the finch-like birds were actually very closely related, and the story of the natural history of these birds needed to be rewritten. Proposed the process of speciation that took place when one population of finch, similar to the purple finch, diverged into the iwi honeycreeper on the Big Island of Hawaii and the parrot-bill honeycreeper of Maui. So this guy, what a beautiful bird that is, right? The adult is mostly scarlet with black wings and tail and a long curved salmon-colored bill used primarily for drinking nectar. It is found on the Big Island of Hawaii, and the contrast of the red and black plumage with surrounding green foliage makes it one of the most easily seen birds in Hawaii. In the early winter, in January to June, the birds pair off and mate as their special plants reach their flowering maximum. The female lays 2 to 3 eggs in a small cup-shaped nest made of tree fibers, petals, and down feathers. These bluish eggs hatch in 14 days. The chicks are yellowish-green, marked with brownish-orange. The chicks fledge in 24 days and are soon on their own. The parrotbill, on the other hand, can only be found on Maui. It lives on the undisturbed windward slopes of Haleakala in mesic and wet forest between 1,200 and 2,150 meters in elevation. The entire range of these birds is only 19 square miles. The Maui parrotbill is an insectivore. It doesn't drink nectar. It uses its large beak and powerful jaw muscles to remove bark and wood from small trees and shrubs, eating the insects underneath. It also bites open fruits in search of insects and is fond of moth pupae and beetle larvae. It is a monogamous bird and breeds between November and June. Females build a cup-shaped nest out of lichens and twigs 40 feet above the forest floor. Pairs raise a single nestling per season. The female incubates the eggs for 16 days and the fledglings remain with their parents for 5 to 8 months as they learn how to forage. Wow, that's amazing. So, these species seem very similar, but the reality is molecularly they're actually pretty closely related. So, how does one species become two species? Through speciation and natural selection. So, again, describe the phases of speciation and the stages of natural selection that develop a division between species. So, if we're using this type of chart again, we need to talk about separation, adaptation, division, and the natural selection, overpopulation, inherited variation, struggle to survive, and survival of the fittest. Again, I gave some background information that I'm now going to reorganize into this kind of a chart. So, two population of finches developed on the Hawaiian Islands. Natural selection led to adaptations or different traits that are favored in each natural environment. In each population, more offspring are born than can survive given the resources available. Again, these can be fairly general statements, even though it's applied to a new example. Through mutations and gene shuffling, the offspring born were not clones, but they're different from both their parents and from one another. Some are born with long bills, good for sipping nectar, while others develop tough beaks for ripping bark from trees in order to eat insects. So this is where you describe how the babies are different, how the species come about with different traits. In this part, you describe why they are successful. So each generation, and again, I picked one to describe why it was successful in its unique environment. Each generation of finches competed for limited resources such as food, water, shelter, and mates. They also had to avoid predators and not succumb to disease. The Honeycreeper finches thrived on the Big Island of Hawaii due to the ability to use these specific plants. Now, we could describe why the parrotbill honeycreeper was successful in its very unique niche. It has a very unique role in its environment. It's successful where it is because it nests way up in the trees. It takes really good care of its offspring. It's able to focus on specific insectivores. It's not competing, it finds its own niche so then it doesn't have to compete for the exact same resources that the parrot or that the other honeycreeper is. And therefore, they both can still exist, right? Because they're not completely excluding each other from the environment. So, again, getting into this type, the red honeycreeper one, the honeycreeper finches on the Big Island were able to get more food and live longer and reproduce more. If they can get a lot of nectar, they can get a lot of energy. The offspring thus carried on the long bills used for drinking nectar. And the ancestral finch gave rise to the red honeycreepers on the Big Island and the parrot-bill honeycreepers, and they achieved official designation as a separate species when the two varieties could no longer interbreed and produce viable offspring. Again, that's another general statement just to um, make sure you understand what it means when there's a division of species. Again, breaking it down, separation, adaptation into the 4 stages of natural selection, and then we have a division. Again, this is how we filled out that chart. Another example, bum, bum, bum. Corvidae is a cosmopolitan family of oscine passerine birds that contains the crows, ravens, rooks, jackdaws, jays, magpies, treepies, choughs, and nutcrackers. That in common English, they are known as the crow family, or more technically, corvids. There are over 120 species. The genus Corvus, including the jackdaws, crows, and ravens, makes up over a third of the entire family. They are considered the most intelligent of the birds and among the most intelligent of all animals, having demonstrated self-awareness in mirror tests, which was done with European magpies, and tool-making abilities seen in crows and rooks, skills until recently regarded as solely the province of humans and a few other higher mammals. Their total brain-to-body mass ratio is equal to that of great apes and cetaceans, and only slightly lower than in humans. They are medium to large in size, with strong feet and bills, rictal bristles, and a single molt each year. Most passerine birds molt twice. Corvids are found worldwide except for the tip of South America and the polar ice caps. The majority of the species is found in tropical South and Central America, Southern Asia, and Eurasia, with fewer than 10 species in Africa and Australasia. The earliest corvid fossils date to the mid-Miocene, about 17 million years ago. So, over the years, has been much disagreement on the exact evolutionary relationships of the corvid family and their relatives. What eventually seemed clear was that the corvids are derived from Australasian ancestors, from there spread throughout the world. Australasia, a region of Oceania, comprises Australia, New Zealand, and the island of New Guinea, and neighboring islands in the Pacific Ocean. It appears that after the ancestral magpie spread over Eurasia, the Korean population became isolated, at which point the species crossed the Bering Land Bridge and colonized North America, where the two American magpies then differentiated. Fossil evidence indicates that the ancestral North American magpie had arrived in its current range around the mid-Pliocene, 3 to 4 million years ago, and that the yellow-billed magpie lineage split off rather soon thereafter due to the Sierra Nevada uplift and the beginning ice ages. A comparatively low genetic difference, however, suggests that some gene flow between the black-billed and yellow-billed magpies still occurred during interglacial periods during the Pleistocene. So these guys, um, these are a bird when I moved out west that I saw a lot that I never saw before, and they'd be doing a lot of the same kind of things you might see crows do. But I'd see these black-billed ones in Colorado. But there are other varieties of these yellow-billed varieties that actually exist in California. So the yellow-billed magpie is a large bird in the crow family that is restricted to the U.S. state of California. It's in the Central Valley and adjacent chaparral foothills and mountains. Apart from its having a yellow bill and yellow streak around its eye, it's virtually identical to the black-billed magpie found in much of the rest of North America. So here, the black-billed magpie, also known as the American magpie, is a bird in the crow family that inhabits the western half of North America from southern coastal Alaska, northern California, northern Arizona, northern New Mexico, central Kansas, and Nebraska. So this is a little tricky because if you're going to describe how they came about, um, they're almost identical, aren't they? Right? It's just that bill. But we still go through the same process. We talk about the separation. We've got two populations in North America, one in California on the one side of the Sierra Nevada mountains and the other side in the western half of North America from Alaska to New Mexico. So these two populations developed different traits based on where they're located. California had yellow bills and a yellow streak around its eye. More were born than can survive. There's differences. Some were born with yellow bills while others had black bills. They struggled to survive. They competed for limited resources. Now, um, is there anything that we can see just based off of those descriptions that are really like, how is a yellow bill or a black bill actually able to help them get more food, water, or shelter? That's pretty hard to say. Maybe it has to do with some type of heat retention. Some of these big toucans and stuff like that radiate a lot of heat through their bill, but that's not really what I think is happening here. It could just be some sexual selection where the yellow-billed magpies in California proved to be more successful in gathering mates based on that area and the female's choice in that area. So the yellow-billed variety in California was able to live longer and breed more and passed on yellow-billed traits to their offspring. The yellow-billed magpie achieved designation as a separate species when they could no longer interbreed and produce viable offspring with the black-billed magpies. Okay, now my last big example, and then I want to explain about what you guys need to do in order to come up with your example. So you need to go to Wikipedia, you need to pick an organism, you need to look at the family here. You need to pick a species within that families. You need to look at where that species lives compared to some of the other species or compared to the family, and look at how your species is different than the other species in that family. And from there, you can talk about separation, adaptation, and division, and then natural selection there. So, hyena. When you go to Wikipedia, you can see that there's many varieties of hyena. When I thought hyenas are super interesting, but I always thought this is the hyena, right? And I thought that's the hyena. And it gets, Disney sometimes gives things bad raps because they stereotype animal species as well. But so sometimes it's good to realize that, not use Disney for all of your biology knowledge. But as we go in here, so again, you pick a species, you look at the different, the family range, and you can look at the species range where they exist compared to other ones. And we can look at the different environments in these different locations and what traits each individual species has. Even though they are going to be closely related because they're within the same family, they have different adaptations based on different locations where they live. So the first thing you have to do is pick species and figure out where they live, and then do a little research about what characteristics they have. So, and then you're going to have to go through this and explain the whole separation, adaptation, division to me. So when it comes to describing the separation, you should be asking yourself, what led to reproductive isolation? Did it occupy a new geographic region? Is it in a new habitat? And through my research on hyenas on Wikipedia, I found that the ancestor population of Hyenidae in Eurasia were arboreal. They lived around trees, scavenging on dead animals left behind from larger predators. As competition around carcasses increased, some individuals developed more social behaviors along with larger teeth and jaws and were able to actually kill their prey instead of just scavenging. These killers followed the large migrating herds into Africa, leaving behind the smaller arboreal hyenas in Eurasia. This created a geographic isolation of populations. And then we talk about adaptation. What traits? So, large teeth, strong jaws, social behaviors were favored in the spotted hyenas following the big migrating herds, while agility to capture insects and a strong digestive system favored the aardwolf, which eat rotten carrion and termite excretions. So, we look at this from a picture basis. You're going to have overpopulation. You've got a parent that's having lots of babies. Some of those babies are going to be different from one another. In the savannas of Africa, these social, larger hyenas with strong jaws are going to be able to feed off of these large migrating herds of herbivores, whereas these guys are going to have to occupy a different niche, still scavenging and eating insects and stuff like that, where these guys can take down larger prey. Now, in the savannas, these guys are going to have an advantage, and these genes are going to pass on and be spread into the next generations after that. So, in words, more hyenas are born than can survive. Inherited variation, some are born larger with stronger teeth and are more social. Others are small with better ability to digest. Struggle to survive. The larger hyenas thrive in the savanna where they can hunt together and kill large game. Spotted hyenas make offspring with similar traits, big teeth and social hunting. And then we have division. Two populations of hyenas, spotted and aardwolf, are no longer able to interbreed and produce offspring, therefore they are separate species, and ultimately that is what I'm looking for you to do. So, here is your task. Go to Wikipedia, pick an organism. I like chameleons, so I'm going to type in chameleon. Hey, we got chameleons. Guess what? There's more than one type of chameleon. Holy smokes. What I want you to do is read about the evolution. Whatever organism you type into Wikipedia will have in the contents part here, evolution. And I want you to read and try and understand some of what they're describing here, the evolution of that organism. Now, as we go back, and we look at the side here, pick a species in the family. So again, if you're looking here, again, you have chameleon, you have the contents, you read about the evolution. You go here, and in the family, it's the family of Chameleonidae, something like that. And now, if you go over these different genera, we have genus and species. So now, if you just scroll over it, you can see pictures and it'll talk about where they're located. So go and check out some of these. Now, I don't want you guys to do chameleons because this is the example I'm showing you, but you can see there's many different varieties here, right? And if you go into all these different ones, you can follow these links and you can read about what makes them unique, where they live, what traits they have in their environment. And that is going to lead you to being able to do this major task. So, again, if we follow this in steps, go to Wikipedia, pick an organism, read about the evolution. What is the family? Pick a species in that family or pick two species and compare those species that live in different locations. Where do they live? How is the range of the family different from the range of the species? How are the environments in those locations different? And then how is the species different than the other species? What adaptations do they have, and how are those adaptations helpful in their environment? And then from there, you will create a presentation that describes separation, adaptation, and division, describing those stages of natural selection. So that is your major task for this week. Again, I'll give you a little bit of a guide to help you through this, but I want you to be able to come up with your own example. I've given you 5 examples and a half of an example with the chameleon, but I want you to pick something that you're interested in. Ultimately, you're going to fill in these blanks. Talk about the separation, where they live. Talk about, and some of this is just plugging in the names of the species, right? But then tell me how they're different. Tell me why those differences are helpful in the environment where they live, and then what traits are getting passed on. And then they can't interbreed. This is just plugging in the names of the species, right? So hopefully this isn't too challenging with all of these examples, but ultimately I need you guys to understand speciation and the stages of natural selection. So hopefully all of this can help you get you on your way this week.